Hi there, and welcome back for our next lesson of APUS history. Today we're going to be looking at topic 4.12, African Americans in the Early Republic. As always, you can click down in the description if you want some follow along notes to guide you as you go through this lesson. So we're going to stay focused on this objective, explaining the continuities and changes in the experience of African Americans from 1800 to 1848. Now, the College Board has two particular key concepts. Anti-slavery efforts in the South were largely limited to unsuccessful rebellions by enslaved people. While that is true, we're going to go a little bit outside of this, and I'm going to tell you about some rebellions that were more successful. And then the second one is enslaved Blacks and free African Americans created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and family structures, and they joined political efforts aimed at changing their status. So we're going to start with some historical context, go through some rebellions that were successful and unsuccessful, and then we're going to dive into enslaved Black communities and free African American communities. So, to remind you, in this time period, there was the Haitian Revolution. It's completed in 1804, and it really is where we see a group of enslaved Africans take over, and Haiti becomes a free republic outside of French control. And this is going to massively increase fears in the United States over a similar rebellion happening. Additionally, through our early 1800s, kind of thinking 1820s, we've got just a ton happening with economic changes and westward expansion, where we really see the growth of commercial agriculture, focusing on king cotton, focusing on the cotton crop, which is an extremely labor-intensive crop, having a lot of impact on the number of enslaved people living in this region. The next 2 points, the adoption of universal white male suffrage, as well as the Second Great Awakening and reform movements, led to additional conversations in the United States and efforts to make the country more representative, the political process more representative of the people, and actually abolishing slavery. So all of that is happening while slavery is growing. So let's talk about the most common methods. We would call these covert methods. They're not overt. They're often going to kind of fly under the radar. These are going to be intentional work slowdowns, sabotaging the work, faking injury, theft, damage to materials. All of these things were very common. But escape is going to be probably the most detrimental to the economic goals of the white plantation and farm owners. Approximately 50,000 enslaved persons were running away each year. So this is not a small thing that is happening. There's some very famous stories of enslaved people running away, like Frederick Douglass posing as a sailor. He almost gets caught. Harriet Jacobs, if you ever get a chance to read her account called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it is extremely good, informative, figuring out what life was like for many enslaved women in particular. She hid in a crawl space for 7 years, literally living above her children, and then traveled by boat until her family was reunited. Henry Brown shipped himself in a box. William and Ellen Craft, she was very light-skinned, and so she disguised herself as a white male, and her husband took on the role of her manservant while they traveled north. And then, of course, the most famous of our African Americans to escape slavery is usually Harriet Tubman, because of her role on the Underground Railroad, where she continued to go back over the years and eventually guided between 200 and 300 others to the north to freedom. However, while these are the most common areas of resisting slavery, there are over 200 documented slave revolts from 1800 to 1860. And the majority of them are unsuccessful, as the key concept states. So we'll go into the first two most famous ones, and then we'll dive into two that were more successful. So the first one is called the Vesey Conspiracy, and this one was shut down before it even started. So it happened in 1822 in South Carolina, led by Denmark Vesey, who had purchased his freedom, and there were thousands of co-conspirators. We don't quite know how long the plan had been in place, but the plan was to burn Charleston, murder the white residents, seize weapons, and sail for freedom in Haiti. What ended up happening was the plot was leaked and then it was foiled. And this led to Vesey and others being captured, tried, and hanged. And with many of our other slave revolts, what we're going to see is that, especially in South Carolina, we see increased restrictions or slave codes being passed on the freedom of both free and enslaved Black residents. Then the one that is most emphasized by the College Board is going to be Nat Turner's Rebellion. So if you remember any of the rebellions, this is the one that you're going to want to focus on. This happens in 1831 in Virginia. Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher, and he hoped that an insurrection would lead to freedom for African American slaves. And so that was his goal. The newspapers at the time liked to portray Turner as crazy, believing God had chosen him. But he did leave behind an account. It was recorded by a white man, but he left behind a really amazing primary source about his plans and goals for the rebellion and why he did what he did. So Turner and others moved from plantation to plantation, killing between 55 and 60 slave-owning whites and freeing enslaved persons along the way. And then eventually the local militia put down the rebellion, killed many without trials, and then some, like Nat Turner, ended up being tried and executed. So Nat Turner's Rebellion, very similar to the Vesey Conspiracy, led to stricter slave codes. As whites became more and more fearful of these rebellions, they continued to restrict the freedoms of African Americans. Now, the Amistad Rebellion is a successful revolt that happened on the ship, the Amistad. And so this started off as a illegal transportation of Africans to the Americas, because the importation of enslaved persons was now illegal as of 1808. And once in Cuba, 53 Africans were then on their way to a plantation in the Caribbean. But the Africans seized the ship and ordered the sailors to sail for Africa, but instead they sailed north, and the ship was seized in New York, where the Africans were charged with murder. Eventually, the case went to the Supreme Court, and John Quincy Adams, former president at this time, defended the Africans' right to liberty. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor, saying that they had a right to resist unlawful slavery. So here's an actual quote from the senior justice. "It was the ultimate right of all human beings in extreme cases to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice." So recognizing that the act of rebellion is not wrong in some situations. This was a very unique perspective at the time and didn't apply to the cases in the United States because that was still considered to be lawful slavery. In a similar case, the Creole Case in 1841, this was a ship transporting enslaved persons from Virginia to Louisiana, where the captain was overtaken, and they demanded to be sent to Liberia in Africa, but instead traveled to the Bahamas. Now, the Bahamas was free of slavery at this time, and so when the Bahamians got onto the ship, they told the Africans they were free to go ashore. However, the 19 rebels that had taken over the ship were charged with mutiny, but eventually within a couple years they were freed. So similar to the Amistad case, where we start to see how there's a shift in the idea of rebellions. So this next graph is important to note when we're thinking about the communities of African Americans that were either free or enslaved. Now, this free population is going to include whites and blacks, whereas the enslaved population is only going to be enslaved blacks. But what we can see is that between 1800 and 1850 is we just have massive population growth. And much of that enslaved population growth will be happening in the Deep South. So keep this idea in mind as we go through these free communities, or as we go through these communities. So first, let's start with enslaved. So the population increased from 1 million to 4 million between 1800 and 1860. This is primarily due to a high birth rate. There was still illegal importation of slaves from Africa. However, this was not a major factor in the rise of the population. In some areas, the enslaved population was 75% of the total population. Family separation was very common. While most of the African Americans that were enslaved were laboring in fields, there were examples of household domestic workers, and even some examples like Frederick Douglass, where he was able to hire out his time in the city and then earn wages. Women were especially vulnerable, and there were rigid slave codes, as I've already addressed. So, continuing on, there's a big debate over living on a plantation with around 20 enslaved persons was better than living on the very large plantations with 200 or more. The argument is that on the 200 or more size plantations, those would have allowed for the African Americans to live more apart from the whites, and they would have been more likely to engage in strategies that protected their dignity, protected their way of life, and provided more opportunities for community. And so some of these things that happened, especially on these larger plantations, was the preservation of religious practices. And so one of the common religions that came from Africa to America was Islam. And so in some ways, this would be combined with elements of Christianity. Additionally, they formed extended family units. So as you saw in the previous slide, a huge number of families were broken up, and they formed extended families in order to make sure that children and partners, that there was this sense of community. They often maintained African names and customs and language, and they utilized folk tales, dance, and music. And this would have been a major way for them to talk about ideas of freedom without the enslavers noticing. So one example that maybe you've heard of is the tale of Brer Rabbit. And this is going to be a common folk tale that began within enslaved communities. And so the tale of Brer Rabbit is this idea of this rabbit who's going to be a trickster, outwit other characters, and is a way for them to African Americans to associate with these ideas where they can assert their humanity. So Professor John Stauffer of Harvard talks about this tale of Brer Rabbit and how this connected to African American communities. He said, "You gain respect through tricks, through subversion. You outwardly show your deference to a white or master, but you subvert that deference in ways that the white does not see, cannot understand. You cannot be open about your subversiveness." So this was a way to protest covertly, like we talked about at the start of the lesson. So to conclude, let's talk about the free Black communities that developed. Around half of free African Americans were in the North, with the other half staying in the South, probably to maintain closeness to families or partners, as maybe they were free, but their family was not. In 1833, there was the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which many African Americans in the North participated in, trying to use political strategies to move towards abolition. Many famous abolitionists, there's just a few. In the image here, you see Sojourner Truth. Another thing that was very common in free Black communities was the emphasis on religion, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church developed in response to the segregation and discrimination that was still prevalent in churches after the Second Great Awakening. Another major aspect of free communities was literacy, emphasizing not only learning to read and write, but then using that as a method for spreading ideas of abolition. So two famous newspapers and journals were the North Star by Frederick Douglass and Freedom's Journal. And then also slave narratives, as I also mentioned, were very common at this time, where formerly enslaved people wrote about their experience. And these had a huge impact on the growing abolition movement, especially in the North. So I hope this lesson was really helpful for you in learning about the continuities and changes that happened in the experiences of African Americans in this period. And if so, please like and subscribe.